Hey everyone, ready to switch gears? We're diving deep into the electric car revolution today.
It's way more than just trading gas stations for charging stations, that's for sure.
You got that right. And today we're focusing on the European Union, specifically their big Green Deal plan.
Right. We want to see how those policies are impacting, like the actual car market. Are they on the right track?
Yeah, are they helping or hurting? To figure that out, we're dissecting this fascinating analysis from Testo Incolato. It's an Italian podcast, so you know we're giving you the exclusive English breakdown.
And what they're saying is really interesting.
So give it to me straight. What's the headline? What's got everyone talking?
Well, they make a pretty strong case that, and this is going to sound a little counterintuitive, that the EU might actually be boosting China's role in the whole electric car market, even if it's unintentional.
Wait, hold on. The EU is helping China get ahead. How does that even work? That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, it's a head scratcher, right? The podcast points to a few key things, but the most in-your-face one is price.
Okay, because I'm trying to wrap my head around how the EU is just like handing over the keys to the electric car market. Give me an example.
Let's say you're looking at the BYD Dolphin. It's a pretty cool electric car, by the way. In China, you're looking at about $15,000. Take that same car over to France, it's nearly $29,000.
Whoa, hold up. Almost double the price. That's insane.
And get this, that's with a 10% import tax already included.
So are we saying that Chinese cars are just cheaply made then? Is that the difference?
Actually, that's the thing. They're not. A lot of these Chinese electric vehicles are really exceeding expectations. Like they're getting those top safety ratings. The 5 stars from Euro NCAP.
Oh, right. The European New Car Assessment Program.
Exactly. And honestly, some of these cars are even outpacing some European brands when it comes to like the features and the tech you get.
Huh. So it's not about cutting corners. It's about, well, what is it then? Is that where these EU policies come in?
You got it. The podcast argues that this goal of banning new gas and diesel car sales by 2035, while it sounds good on paper,
it's really putting the squeeze on European car makers who are, let's be honest, already scrambling to come up with those more affordable electric options.
Exactly. And in the meantime, you've got Chinese manufacturers who are ready to roll, ready to meet that demand.
So it's like this weird situation where the EU wants to go green, but might be accidentally giving China a huge advantage.
Yeah, and it's not just about that 2035 deadline either.
There's more.
Oh yeah, there's always more. The podcast also points out that the EU's push for super green technology, while admirable, is driving up the cost of actually making these cars in the EU.
Compared to China, where things are just cheaper?
Right, like energy and raw materials are often way cheaper there.
It's like a double whammy for European car makers. They're trying to meet this deadline, but their costs are through the roof, so they can't compete on price. That's rough.
It really is. That's like that classic example of good intentions maybe not shaking out the way you thought they would.
Yeah, for sure. And to make things even spicier, they contrast all of this with what's going on in America, which I gotta say is pretty interesting.
Oh, it's fascinating. What's ironic is that the U.S., with that Inflation Reduction Act, seems to be doing what the podcast says the EU should be doing. I mean, it's not just about giving money to people to buy electric cars.
Right, which is what it seems like a lot of countries are trying to do, just like make the cars cheaper, right?
Exactly. But the U.S. is going a step further. They're giving these huge tax breaks to companies, and we're talking massive here, but only if they manufacture those electric car parts in the U.S.
So they're trying to, supercharge the entire industry from start to finish.
Exactly. And that's drawing in tons of investment, encouraging all this new tech and innovation. It's a totally different game plan than what the EU is running with.
And you're telling me this is all coming from an Italian podcast? They're impressed with how America's handling this whole thing.
Well, it's not like it's all praise for the U.S., though. They also bring up Tesla,
Oh, of course. Tesla's like the big name in electric cars. How do they fit into all of this?
Right. Well, the podcast uses them as, an example of how fast things are changing in the market. Take the Model Y, for instance, right?
Yeah.
It's a European bestseller. In the first half of 2023, it sold more than any other car in its class. And I don't just mean electric cars. I mean any car.
Wow, seriously. I knew Tesla's popular, but to actually outsell every other car in Europe, that's crazy.
It's a big deal. And going back to those price differences we were talking about, the podcast points out that Tesla's been dropping its prices all over the globe, too.
That is
a global thing. It's not just some China-EU showdown,
Okay, so we've got China pumping out these affordable EVs. We've got America stepping in with their big Inflation Reduction Act plan. And then we've got Tesla shaking things up everywhere with these price cuts and huge sales. So where does that leave the EU in all of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Honestly, that's where the podcast gets a little Uncomfortable, I guess you could say.
Oh, uncomfortable. How? I want to
Yeah.
hear this.
Okay, well, they draw this parallel that's kind of unsettling.
Okay.
They bring up Europe's dependence on Russian gas,
Yep.
right?
I remember that whole situation didn't exactly end well.
Exactly. And what they're suggesting is that the EU's reliance on China for their green tech, I mean, that could be the next big crisis in the making.
So instead of relying on Russia for their gas, now they might be relying on China for all the stuff they need to, go green. I see why you said uncomfortable.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure, because it's not even just about the cars anymore, right? We're talking about the EU's entire Green Deal plan. They need all this technology, batteries, solar panels, the whole 9 yards to meet their own goals, to do what they said they were going to do.
So they're kind of stuck, aren't they? Because they have to go green, but it's super expensive to make that tech in Europe. And now they're relying on these supply chains that are, heavily influenced by, let's just say, not exactly their best buddies on the economic playground.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And actually, some people are even talking about putting sanctions on Chinese car makers, you know?
Sanctions, like what they did with Russia. Whoa.
Yeah, some people are saying that's the only way to protect European industry, to keep them in the game. But the podcast argues that it could totally backfire.
In what way? How so?
Well, I mean, think about it. What happens if China's like, oh yeah, two can play that game? And they start slapping tariffs on European goods, or even worse, they disrupt the supply chain even more. European companies are already up against the wall trying to compete on price, It could be a disaster for them.
It's like they need China, but they don't want to need them too much at the same time. That's a tough spot. So if sanctions aren't the answer, what is? What do they suggest?
Yeah, it's the thing. There's no easy fix,
Yeah.
No magic wand they can wave, but they do point to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, how it's been really effective at encouraging companies to both make and buy electric vehicles right there in America.
Which, if I'm following you, is kind of the opposite of what the EU is doing, right? It's like the US is pulling businesses in while the EU might be pushing them away.
It's a real concern, yeah, and not just for cars either. The podcast is saying that the EU could fall behind in like crucial investments, technological development, all that stuff, if they don't make it more appealing for those green tech companies to, set up shop and do business.
So are they saying the EU should just copy America's homework? Is that what they're getting at?
Not exactly copy, but they're definitely saying the EU needs to get a little more real, a little more pragmatic about this whole Green Deal thing,
Hmm.
Focus on building up a green tech sector in Europe that can actually, like, hang with the big players.
Yeah.
Be sustainable, yeah, but also be able to compete on the world stage.
So less about setting these big, ambitious goals and more about actually giving European companies the means to get there.
Hit the nail on the head. It's like they're saying, less stick, more carrot. The podcast really emphasizes that need for, you know, concrete policies that actually support European businesses in making those affordable electric cars, all those green technologies right here in Europe, make it make sense for them to invest here.
I'm with you. That makes sense. We've talked about the 2035 deadline. We've talked about these sky-high production costs over in Europe. Is there anything else they're worried about?
Oh yeah, definitely. And get this one blew my mind a little bit, I'm not going to lie. They start talking about the price difference between making these electric vehicles in Europe versus China, right?
Lay it on me.
Get this, on average, making batteries in the EU costs a whopping 33% more than in China. 33%.
Whoa, you're kidding. So even if European car makers manage to catch up on the tech side of things, they're still toast when it comes to price.
You see what I'm saying? That's a massive disadvantage right out of the gate. And we haven't even talked about those higher energy costs in Europe either.
Oh, right. Because it's not just about batteries. That energy cost goes into the whole process of making the car, right?
That's what I'm saying. The podcast points out that overall, energy costs are about 45% higher in Europe compared to China. 45%. It's crazy.
Which, duh, makes everything more expensive. So really, it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about figuring out how to fix these big systemic issues, right? Because that's what's holding these European companies back.
100%. That's the whole point they're making.
Yeah.
And they're running out of time to figure it out.
It's like, I don't know, watching a train wreck in slow motion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The EU wants to be the leader in this whole green future thing, but they keep hitting these roadblocks and everyone else is just like zooming past them.
Yeah, I get that. And the podcast doesn't try to sugarcoat it either,
Mhm.
They straight up say that the EU needs to get it together and fast if they want to stay relevant, especially with China and the US both gunning for that top spot.
I feel like we always talk about this green transition in this really abstract way, but this podcast makes it so real. This isn't just about like saving the planet anymore. It's about geopolitics, about economic survival.
Totally. And, to be fair, they do offer some hope, some things to be optimistic about. Like they bring up France.
Hmm.
They rely a lot on nuclear power, right?
Right.
So they've actually got a decent amount of energy independence compared to, say, Germany, who's still really into coal.
Which is huge because you got to think about where that energy is coming from if you want to drive an electric car.
You got it. The podcast uses France and Germany to kind of illustrate this point that the entire EU needs to rethink its energy sources, diversify.
Yeah.
They can't be so reliant on other countries, and not just for energy, but also for all that technology that's needed to actually build a greener future. Batteries, solar panels, you name it.
It's all connected. If you
Mhm.
want to drive an electric car, you got to think about where the electricity to charge it is coming from, where the stuff to make the battery is coming from, where all the car parts are made.
It's crazy when you start thinking about it, right? It's about building a whole new way of doing things from the ground up. And honestly, the podcast kind of hints that the EU hasn't quite figured out how to coordinate all of that yet. Long-term planning isn't exactly their strong suit.
So where do we go from here? It's a lot to unpack. We've got these challenges facing the EU, these global power dynamics, and who knows who's going to come out on top. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel, or is it just more tunnel?
Well, like I said, there's no magic solution,
Yeah.
but the podcast does leave you with some things to think about. They make this point that this isn't just a problem for politicians and big companies to figure out. It's on all of us.
Okay, what can we do besides, maybe becoming electric car battery engineers?
That's always an option.
Yeah.
But really, they talk about how important it is to just like stay informed, to support businesses that are trying to do things the right way, and just be aware of our own habits.
Yeah.
What are we doing that's contributing to the problem? Can we do things differently?
So don't just check out because it feels overwhelming. Every little bit counts. Right?
Exactly. Don't underestimate the power of just talking about this stuff either. The more we bring it up with friends, family, that coworker who always leaves the lights on, the more pressure it puts on those in charge to make bigger changes.
Yes. Love that. Have those awkward conversations, people. It might feel weird, but it matters.
It really does. Every conversation is a step towards a solution.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been a wild ride. We've covered so much ground today. The electric car revolution, those challenges the EU is facing, and just how much the global power dynamics are shifting. It's clear that this is only the beginning.
Yeah, we've only just scratched the surface here. I mean, think about it. Ethically sourcing those raw materials, figuring out what's next for battery tech, it's constantly evolving.
Definitely something we'll have to keep an eye on for sure. But for now, we want to hear from you. What surprised you the most about today's deep dive? Any burning questions we didn't get to?
Head over to our social media. Let's chat. Like we said, we're all in this together, so let's keep this conversation going.
Who knows, your question might spark our next deep dive. Until next time, everyone, thanks for listening.